Father Murr.
Good afternoon to you, Robert.
It is Ash Wednesday, and you have the ashes, and
I have the ashes to prove it. That's right.
Ash Wednesday is the beginning of Lent, the season leading toward Easter, and Ash Wednesday reminds us of our mortality.
Yes, it also reminds us of the Sit transit gloria mundi, that the glory of this life is passing. If people don't know this, it's a part of our tradition comes from a Roman tradition. We are Roman Catholics, of a general who had won lands for Rome and added to the Roman Empire, was given a triumphal procession it was called, but it's a parade into this toward the Senate in the center of Rome. What? For goodness sake, I'm forgetting.
Capitoline Hill at the end of the Roman Forum.
But the Via is the what?
The Sacra Via. The Via Appia. The Via Appia.
No, the Via Sacra. Via Sacra. All right, so that would take place on a very special occasion. The army of the general that was also in Rome would have to stay on the other side of the river in what is called Trastevere, the other side of the river, the neighborhood of Trastevere. They were not permitted in out of fear that they might take over the government. Right? So they were separated. The general was given this procession in. It was to the glory of Rome. It wasn't to his personal glory. That's what they were trying to get across. And alongside of his chariot, a young man would run with ashes, and he would continue to throw a small amount of ash into the conquering general's face as he went through the procession, and he would say,
Sic transit.
Sic
transit gloria mundi.
Sic transit gloria mundi. The glory of this world is transitory. It's passing. All right, to remember that. That's where part of this ceremony of Ash Wednesday comes from. But also the Old Testament talks about wearing ash and doing penance. So we've got this mixture of the two, and this is what we do every Ash Wednesday. It's a beautiful ceremony to solemnize the beginning of Lent.
Yes, and so we've begun Lent, and last week we talked about having a program which would discuss one of the most fascinating and in many ways important figures in the last two generations, Malachi Martin. You knew Malachi. He was the author of many books. He died in 1999, so he's been dead for almost 25 years now.
It's amazing, yeah.
And it would take many different programs to talk about him, but I suppose we can start by saying that he's a key source in his writings for arguments about the liturgy, about the Second Vatican Council, about the Jesuit order. He was a Jesuit, about Freemasonry infiltrating into the church, and about the question of the relation between Catholics and Jews, and particularly the publication of Nostra Aetate at the end of the Second Vatican Council.
Yes.
And perhaps above all, the third secret of Fatima, and the relationship of that to the question of Russia and its conversion. In all of these questions, which have been material for great amount of discussion in the church, Malachi Martin had a great deal to say and was at the center of the debate.
Yes, there's no question. He had a great amount to say on a great amount of things. Yes.
And here's a nice picture of him. And he was born in Ireland, and he took American citizenship. He was born in 1921 in July. He died in 1999, also in July, just a few days after his birthday. So he was 78 years old. He had 5 children in his family, 4 brothers and 6 children, I think, 4 brothers and a sister, and the 4 brothers all became priests. He was from County Kerry, and, he himself, as this brief summary biography of his studies shows, he became a Jesuit at the age of 33, and was ordained. And he took a PhD in archaeology at the Oriental Institute in Semitic languages and paleography. And he became a professor of paleography in Rome. And he studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the late 1940s. So he was an expert in Oriental languages and reading that writing, paleography. And in 1958, just as John the 23rd is elected, and he's in his 30s himself, he is a young man, a young priest in Rome, a young Jesuit, a brilliant scholar, and he became the private secretary to Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was a German cardinal, extremely learned, had been the head of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and was the the personal confessor of Pope Pius XII. So right in those years from 58 to 64, the council will begin in 62, and in 64 or 65, he will request, Malachi Martin, Father Martin, will request to be released from his vows and from the Jesuit order in 1964. And the faculties as a priest were restored in 1989. I cannot say with total certainty what exactly all these things meant, except that clearly from 58 to 64, the election of John the 23rd, the decision to hold the Second Vatican Council, the council itself with hundreds and hundreds of journalists in Rome looking at the transformation after 400 years of the Catholic Church from the Tridentine Church to what we've got to the Vatican II Church. He was at the center of all activities because his cardinal, the secretary to Cardinal Bea, was a key figure at the council and was handling the document Nostra Aetate, which dealt with the relations between Catholics and Jews and the whole question of ecumenism, which is the understanding of the Catholic Church and its role with regard to other Christian churches and then to other religions. All of this meant that in his late 30s into his early 40s, he was at the center of everything in Rome. He was no doubt well informed. And there's a book by the Time magazine correspondent who was covering the council in 1962 into 63 that says that he became a close friend with Malachi Martin. His name was Robert Blair Kaiser. He too had studied with the Jesuits for 10 years. And then he was working for Time magazine in Rome. And he said Malachi Martin told him many things. He was a source of many things that he wrote in his articles for Time. And later, after the council, Malachi Martin went to America, became an American citizen, and started to write books. And he wrote many different books. And some were novels and some were nonfiction. But even in his novels, there's fact. And so we create the word faction for a mixture of fact and fiction for the works of Malachi Martin. I myself, reading his works, always find tremendous insight into the Vatican. He gives the names of people. He talks about their interests and their line of action and whether they're progressive or conservative. And he really does know. And here's one of the books he wrote, The Keys of This Blood, about John Paul II and his relations with the Soviets. The Soviet Union had not yet fallen. Jesuits, which was a tremendous book. Archbishop Vigano said it was important also to him to read this book by Malachi Martin, because he goes through the whole history of the Jesuit order. And then particularly he looks at the modern history as the Jesuits shift from being the most loyal supporting organization to the Holy Father to being kind of critical and contesting the Holy Father. Here's Malachi Martin, Windswept House, talking about infiltration of the Vatican by modernist and globalist forces in the 1990s. A lot of people know about this book. Here's another book he wrote about the conclave of Soviet espionage influencing the elections of 1978. So you knew Malachi Martin. I think we'd start with that, and then we can talk about all that you would like to discuss. I don't think we'll finish in the hour, but whether it's Fatima or whether it's the liturgy, Malachi Martin had something to say. What do you think, Father?
Well, he had a lot to say about a lot of things, right? Let me just say that I read his book on the Jesuits. That was the first thing that I read of his.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember exactly when it came out, but I believe it was in the 80s.
Jesuits, 1987.
1987. So 87 or 88, I read his book on the Jesuits, and I was very impressed with it, except that he's got two priests named as Jesuits who were not Jesuits. One of them was Gustavo Gutierrez, who is the father of Theology of Liberation, Peruvian priest. He is not a Jesuit. And I think also, didn't he put in Buff? Leonardo Buff?
Buff was a Franciscan, yeah.
Was a Franciscan, but he included them as Jesuits for whatever reason.
Well, even Homer nods, we might say, or even Malachi Martin, occasionally, with all this flood of writing prior to the internet, prior to computers, he was a great researcher and a brilliant man, no question. He perhaps made mistakes on a couple of occasions, or because his books are so intricate, sometimes he may have said things just to leave a clue that maybe he thought someone would pick up on.
I think what he was doing with the Jesuits was he was principally talking about the Jesuits, but he brought in these other two because they were also important men in the stream of Jesuit theology. The Jesuits really, in the 1970s, embraced what is called theology of liberation. What is theology of liberation? And this is, Malik and I had many talks on this. Theology of liberation is basically, I'm going to oversimplify it in the answer, basically Marxism applied to the gospel. Now, when you do that, you're in very, very dangerous waters.
Yeah.
Because it's to take politics, a politics which, by the way, was condemned by the church, the Marxism and communism, condemned by the church. You could not be a good practicing Catholic, a Catholic in good standing, and be a Marxist or a communist. And the Jesuits took this philosophy, which, by the way, Robert, there's been some discussion on this in another program that I was on. I was of the understanding that it came out of Germany. The theory of theology of liberation was a German theory. And as the Germans are always fond of doing, they created it, but they sent it to Latin America for application.
Yeah.
Right? They exported it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
Do you want to say something?
Well, there's a bridge between Germany and Latin America that continues to this day. And there were German exiles and farmers and businessmen and workmen who went to Brazil, went to Argentina, went to Peru. There's colonies of Germans in many Latin American countries. And the church would often give scholarships. There's these major funding organizations of the German church, Renovabis, Aid to the Church in Need, and the church would bring
the heaviest donor of the Catholic Church in Latin America was Caritas out of Germany. They would give grants and grants, millions and millions of dollars, or Deutschmark in those days, to Latin America. And they also began to have a particular slant on who they gave money to and for what. And it started to involve a certain political agenda also. It wasn't just Catholics giving to Catholics. They were giving to social justice causes.
Yeah.
And these were connected to theology of liberation. Theology of liberation, let me just be clear on this, the father, if you will, of theology of liberation was Gustavo Gutierrez. He was a priest from Peru. I had the opportunity of speaking with him. He gave a lecture in Rome when I was there, and it was to about 100 of us, and then open to questions. And his philosophy was, I asked him the question. What I wanted to know was, would he go so far in this idea of revolution? They wanted to cause a revolution, if you will, a Christian revolution in different countries, especially Latin America. Right? Well, now what that is, God only knows. But I asked the question, which everybody wanted to ask, but I think a lot of them were afraid to. Does that include violence? Would you include violence in that Christian revolution? Is part of theology of liberation also including violence? He said that it did.
Yeah.
He had no problem with that. Well, that immediately told me and told a number of other people, this isn't Christian. That's not what Christianity is about. To include violence in an overtake. All right. Anyway, the Jesuits in great part espoused this. They took theology of liberation and they brought it to all parts that they themselves were involved in Latin America. And this caused a lot of problems. It caused a lot of problems for whom? For bishops, especially for bishops who were trying to maintain order in their dioceses, because any place that the Jesuits had schools, which was all over Latin America, they were teaching this, especially in their university students, to their university students. So it caused an awful lot of friction, They were constantly in trouble with bishops until a whole different group of bishops who were much more liberal were appointed by Rome. Right? You have something to add?
Well, we're on a topic that's of extreme importance. You said it's not Christian. They wanted to say, yes, it is. They wanted to say Christianity doesn't have to be meek and submissive and enslaved by ideological, financial powers who will keep everyone miserable for centuries and centuries while they have their palaces. They wanted to overthrow that old regime. And the problem is, as each step you take in that direction towards earthly revolution, you leave the way of the cross. And so at a certain point, you pass over the boundary between what is Christian, which does include sacrifice, even of one's own life, and in order to save one's own soul and the souls of others, and to follow Jesus in his way of the cross. And instead, you form a revolutionary cadre which wants to overthrow governments, classes, and carry out a communist ideology and bring heaven down to earth. And I've discussed this with many people, including a couple of times with Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict. He traced some of this desire to the millennialism of people like Joachim of Fiore 1,000 years ago, who was the abbot in Calabria, who said, the age of the Holy Spirit is coming, when the age of the Father, which was already ancient history of the law, the age of the Son, the age of grace, the age of the Holy Spirit, superabundant grace, the church itself will change. And this was, he was saying at the time, just before St. Francis of Assisi. The key figure in this process of changing first the Jesuits and then the church from a Christian group following the traditional understanding of Christ as the sacrificial savior who suffers and saves through that suffering, into a Marxist ideological cadre, which really accomplishes something rather than just, according to them, saying pious words, but actually acting, being men for others, and helping even those who are poor and oppressed to understand that they don't have to always live in poverty and oppression. But the key figure is Pedro Arrupe, Father Arrupe, who became the head of the Jesuit order in the 1960s, but had himself, he was from Spain. He was actually, what's a Basque? Yeah, this is Father Arrupe. He's a key figure in the history of the Jesuits. He became the head of the order under Paul VI, and then under John Paul II. John Paul II tried to remove him, actually did remove him, put in another Jesuit named Paolo Dezza in his place in the early 80s. So from the 60s to the 80s, Pedro Arrupe was transitioning the Jesuit order into a group that would say that its commitment was to Jesus Christ and to the Pope, but in fact, it was committed to social justice and stepping over the line at times into what you just described, revolutionary action, including violence. Now, the problem is all of these things have to be studied in great depth in order to be fair. Pedro Arrupe was present in 1945 in the summer in Japan. He'd been a missionary in Japan. Japan had been fighting the Western powers, the Allied powers, and was about to be defeated. And he was in Hiroshima on the edge of the city on the day in August 6th, 1945, when Hiroshima was hit with the only time an atomic bomb has ever been used. And he saw the huge flash of light, and he saw the burning of the city, a firestorm. And then he saw the bodies of people burnt and irradiated. And he, with a couple of his Jesuit brothers, went into the city and started to wash the bodies of dying people. And he was just a young priest at the time, and his heart was completely broken. And he started from that experience to reshape his whole thinking of how Christianity needed to be a powerful ideological force for what he thought of as social justice and getting rid of poverty and getting rid of suffering and depression. And he brought those ideas into the Jesuit order when he became the head of the order in the 60s. A summary. Did you see this same process yourself during your life as a priest and part of the church? Did you see the transition of this Jesuit order in this direction?
Certainly. I would put it simply this way. The Jesuits that I knew were educators, whether they were in universities, high schools, whether they ran parishes or missions. They were first and foremost educators. I think I would not be mistaken by saying that they were, collectively speaking, the most intelligent group of men on earth. I think that's not an exaggeration. Most of them had PhDs, a lot of them in sciences, physics, mathematics, things like that, and a PhD either in philosophy or in theology. So they were brilliant men, and their formation was this way. It was this: a Jesuit. The idea was a Jesuit could be put anywhere in the world and on his own exist. He could take care of himself, exist, foster the kingdom of God at the same time.
Yes.
Right now, there's a funny thing. Just to give you an example of the psychology of that, how does that apply? At the Gregorian University, I remember at least on one occasion, I remember it distinctly, walking down the corridors where the professors lived. They had their residence also at the university. So we had what was so wonderful is that you had the same professors who taught you available to speak to. It was amazing. Always, they were either in the coffee bar or they were always there. Marvelous men. But at around, I don't know, 5 o'clock or 5 o'clock, 5:30, I was walking down the corridor, and I heard in each room, because they had the what is the part of the door that's open at the top with the glass?
Right.
Transom?
Transom, yeah, I think.
Yeah, transom. Anyway, the transoms were open, and so you could kind of hear. And in those days, the divine office was prayed aloud. You didn't say it you didn't say it to yourself or in silence. It was prayed aloud. So you heard every Jesuit. I'm walking down the hall and I'm hearing every Jesuit praying in Latin Vespers.
Amazing.
But they didn't. But my point is, they didn't get together in chapel to pray Vespers. The Dominicans would do that. The Franciscans would do that. Every other community would do that. The Jesuits were trained to do that individually. They were to pray each man on his own, right? And it was about that spirit of individuality that really set them apart and made them some of the great people that they were. It was a different approach to priestly spirituality. At any rate, when the Jesuits were formed, the society was to educate people who would educate people.
Yes.
Right now, that's my point. They had the universities, they had all of the high schools, they had all of these fonts of education, and they gave the best education. There were no better philosophers in the world. There were some of the best scientists in the world were Jesuits. They taught the people who were teaching. They wanted to teach leaders. They wanted leaders sent to them. They wanted tomorrow's leaders here today. They were going to form them, educate them, and those students would change the world. That's something very different than what happened in the late 60s and the 70s. All of a sudden, they ceased that great plan of educating tomorrow's leaders, and they themselves opened up soup kitchens, went into the inner city, did this and that. They started doing these tasks themselves. That was not traditionally considered any of their business, right? They were to create lay people who would do that. And they did in great parts. There were sodalities, there were fraternities of people, of men and women who did the work, Jesuit missionaries, their volunteer programs and what have you. But the Jesuits were remaining in the education. All of a sudden, they got out of education and they themselves were doing that work. Many of them left the Society of Jesus.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, when I was a student in Rome, around 1975, there had been at that time 32,000 Jesuits in the world.
Yes.
And they lost 10,000 left.
Yeah, it's about
got
a third.
Married, whatever, and left. Well, that was a tremendous blow. And then the others also started leaving the traditional strength of the Jesuits to get out and doing social work. Right?
Yeah. So that's
sort of lost their way. My point is they lost their way, according to me. Of course, they think that they found it. Right?
Yes. Well, what we're discussing here is of supreme importance. What you described is an order of men who must be compared to something like the Marine Corps of the church, but something much more than that, even. In other words, the intellectual elite, the well-educated group of men whose lives are a total commitment to the church and to the Pope. And something is happening to that leading group in the church, which then has consequences for the entire church and then for the entire Western society. In other words, you and I are trying to diagnose, starting with the figure of Malachi Martin, a Jesuit, whom you knew, and I once spoke with him on the telephone, actually. Nice conversation. But he was a Jesuit, and his contact was with Jesuits. His books were about the Jesuit order. His perhaps key book on this subject, The Jesuits, explains this process, which helps us to understand what happened to our Catholic Church. And what it is these very educated, very dedicated, very highly trained men, 33,000 of them, as a kind of global army, you might say, but each of them working individually, almost as agents of the church. And this group then starting to change its understanding of itself, its mission. And the chronicling of that is in this book by Malachi Martin, The Jesuits. And I've read the book, and it's a quite riveting account. And it goes a long way to offering the parameters for an analysis of this modern period in the church, our lifetime, actually. And you mentioned
you have to remember too, in this whole context, Malachi Martin, who I knew rather well. We had dinner together often enough in New York, and he was the one who pushed me to start writing. As a matter of fact, when he got the manuscript of my first book, he said that if I didn't write it, I gave him an outline of it. If I didn't write the story, he himself would write it. He thought of it anyway. But here's the thing. Malachi Martin himself petitioned to be released from his vows and from the active priesthood. Right?
Yes.
He did that during the same time. Now, here's something that came up, and I'll show how this applies to understanding who he was and what he was about. There was a great push during the time of Pope John Paul II, who was elected in 1978.
Yes.
John Paul II was elected, and there was a great push in the Congregation for the Clergy, Robert, and the Congregation for Religious. You know what it was? Men who had petitioned to leave the priesthood, who left and got married, then got divorced, and then were asking to return to the priesthood. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases like this, and they were petitioning Rome to return to the priesthood. Pope John Paul II turned down each one of them, each one of those petitions. He would accept no one back. He said, "You made your decision.
Yeah.
You made your decision. That's it." He would have no discussion on the matter. What confuses me is later on in his life, Malachi claims to have gotten back in the good graces of the church, gotten back faculties, his priesthood, and everything else. I don't know how that happened.
Right.
I don't know how that happened. That to me is very mysterious. And then there were rumors of him being a bishop and this, and it just got way out of whack. I didn't know him in those times. I knew him in the it must have been the early 1990s. And I found him very reasonable man. He had an editor who was also a friend of mine. I had no idea that my friend had become his editor, and his name was Father Charles Fiore. Father Fiore was a great Dominican with a great theological mind, very organized, and one of the most entertaining teachers you could ever imagine. He's a great professor. But Father Fiore became his editor to all of his books. And it was through Fiore later on that I talked a lot, because Fiore also started editing my work for me. And you know that when you write something, for anybody who's listening who's tried to write, you absolutely need an editor. You need someone to go through what you're writing and pull it apart, put it back together. It's really some work. Father Fiore told me, and I remember this distinctly, and I already knew this when he said it. He confirmed what I knew. He said, you have to take Malachi with a grain of salt. Everything that he says and everything that he writes. And I said, are you saying that some things that he's writing are not true? He said, I'm not saying it's not true, but he uses a lot of fiction in his writing. And if people are looking for something concrete, they can confuse the fiction part for the real part.
Yeah,
right? That's the confusion that comes in that's come into Malachi Martin's writing. And people who are reading his books think that they're interpreting him correctly, when I think it's probably only known to Malachi Martin and to Father Fiore, who went through it with a fine-tooth comb, both of whom are dead. So it's a little bit complex.
Well, it is certainly. And I guess the paradigm we're using here is to say we have a brilliant Jesuit, no doubt he's brilliant, who became the author of both works of nonfiction and works of fiction. In the works of nonfiction, we have to assume, unless he's made some mistake, that everything he's writing is true. He somehow documented it. But in the works of nonfiction, in his novels, you cannot tell for sure whether he's invented something.
That's exactly the point.
And this raises a number of points which our listeners will want to know about. Perhaps the most shocking of all the things that he ever wrote was of a kind of satanic mass, which involved a sexual activity of abuse that occurred, according to him, at the beginning of his book, Windswept House. It occurred in 1963 in two places, in South Carolina at a kind of black mass, and in the Vatican on the same day, coordinated between kind of satanic forces that wished to infiltrate the church, turn it into an ally of the globalist sort of post-Christian world, and that already the dedication was made back in 1963 to make the council, to make religious life, to make Catholic teaching, to make sexual morality, all this to make it all change and bring forward some of the concerns that we have been facing now for many decades ourselves.
All right, Mark, let me just stop you there for a second, because talking with him about this very subject, there was something that happened. There was such a diabolical happening in the United States at that time. That did happen. There also was a sort of happening like that in Rome by a bishop. Did it happen in the Vatican? It did not. Did it happen in the Pauline Chapel? It did not.
Right.
That is, I'm telling you, anybody who's listening to me, that did not happen in the Pauline Chapel. It's so well guarded. It's guarded by Swiss guards. You would have so many people in on the conspiracy that it wouldn't happen. You couldn't keep it a secret. that part of it did not happen. There was, however, a very wayward bishop who did such a satanic ceremony, supposedly in conjunction with what was happening in the United States. I don't know how much more credence you can give to it. He stretches this out to put it inside the Vatican in the Pauline Chapel. The Pauline Chapel is the Pope's private chapel, for goodness sake. Yeah. This just did not happen, right? And anyway, it's okay. Well, it's got a lot of people going down the wrong track.
Okay, so I do feel there's a danger even in discussing all of these things, but we somehow have to. People are discussing them. There are people who far down the track give total credence and belief. They would perhaps doubt even what you just said, Father. They would say, no.
They're free to do that.
Yeah, but I would just try to say our purpose is to get at the truth, and our purpose is to try to hold and restore the church and its teaching for the next generation. You and I are both getting a little older now, and starting with these podcasts, we've started to talk about things that we kind of carried along for a number of years, meditating upon them, whether it was Cardinal Gagnon, our friend, who died in 2007, had done a tremendous research investigation in the 1970s in the Vatican. Mm-hmm. You were with him personally all in those years, and or whether it was the schism in the sense, or the split with the Lefebvres in 1988 over this question of the liturgy, the question of Annibale Bugnini and his affiliation, yes or no, with Freemasonry.
Robert, if I may, what Malachi Martin did is the following. He saw that the church had taken the wrong direction. And I believe, this is my own interpretation, this could be very incorrect, right? But I don't think it is. I think also he woke up in his own personal life to the fact that he had made a great mistake by leaving the priesthood. I believe he understood that. And his final years were attempting to get back into the church, to the priesthood. But he also was he was a brilliant man. Believe you me, he was brilliant. And a great raconteur. Just fantastic. When we would have dinners together, I would say 2 words or ask him a question and just listen. It was fascinating, everything that he knew. Brilliant man. However, what he was really struggling with toward the end of his life, he saw that the church was going the wrong way. And he really, truly believed that it was going the wrong way because this was a diabolical push, a diabolical push the wrong way. That's what he was convinced of. And in his novels, in his writing, he tried to bring that out. He was convinced that the devil was very much in charge of a lot of people who are making great, important decisions in the Catholic Church. That also, I've discussed it here. That also was the conviction of Cardinal Gagnon, of Mario Marini, of Benelli, of Cardinal Benelli, Monsignor Zanoni. A great number of people were convinced that things were not just wrong, but that they were diabolically wrong. Now that's a strong statement to make, but that's what they believed. Do I believe that? I do believe that. I believe things have gone diabolically wrong. Now, getting back to Malachi Martin, what he's trying to do in his writing, again, this is according to me, is show that diabolical wrongness of direction, that incorrect direction, in novel form. He's trying to get this across to people to show them the diabolical in the history, the present history of the church. That is my take on him. And Father Fiore, Charles Fiore, was also in agreement with that. We talked about that much, right?
Okay. There's about 25 different lines of discussion we could carry forward here, whether it's Fatima, whether it's Nostra Aetate and the Second Vatican Council relations with the Jews. So many issues. Malachi wrote books under another name, Michael Serafian.
Yes.
And and also your idea that he was passing through a spiritual process himself, and in the 90s recognized a tremendous diabolical power, which he himself was contesting in his own life, trying to return to his priesthood, simply gives even greater intensity to the drama of his writing and his life.
Yes.
And I cannot judge Malachi. I have to then take one or 2 points and just sprinkle them in here without pretending to making an overall case. The fact that he's brilliant means he's the type of man who sees things clearly and fast. And he saw stupidity. He saw a piety which was rote piety. He, for some time, was interested in making the church and the intellectual life of the church more acceptable to the Western elites. He didn't want the church to become a backwater, a kind of.
Right.
So at the same time, he slowly became aware that these 10,000 Jesuits who left and the equal number of Dominicans, Franciscans, etc., this was almost a fulfillment of the prophecy in the book of Revelation that a third of the stars of heaven fell.
Yeah.
And we lived through that. We saw people flee from the church as if it was an old fable that needed to be cast aside. And it became very, very popular to say the church was evil, not good, that it produced neurotic souls who were.
Oh, sure. All of that was very popular in the 1960s and 70s with the new advent of psychology. Psychology had come into play.
Yeah.
And everybody was looking to psychology for the answers for everything, rather than biblical or to the church or theological. Yeah.
But and so down this path, Malachi also became a figure in the movement of exorcism. He was even known by the man who did the film, The Exorcist.
Yes.
And
Blake.
Yeah, and he felt there was a action of the evil one, let's say the devil, in the minds and hearts of people, driving them to perdition, driving them to almost insanity, drug abuse, all sorts of other abuse, just throwing everything over that they had loved and cared for, and sort of heading down the hill like the swine in the
chaos
into chaos.
Yeah.
And in some ways, we're the heirs of that, and our whole society, having lost the counterweight to the, let's say, the atheist intellectuals who were arguing that they were reasonable, at least could debate with the Jesuits who were logocentric, Christocentric intellectuals. But the departure from the traditional faith of our intellectual elites left no counterpart to the leftist or globalist elites today and transsexualist elites, which have no counterweight to their illusory visions of what will make us free and blessed and happy. And therefore, our entire society is falling into confusion.
Yes, Robert.
Delusion.
And let me add something to that. You're absolutely correct. And Malachi would absolutely agree with everything you just said. He believed that. He told me that. I heard it. This confusion, he was convinced that was diabolical. He really was. And that brings in the whole struggle. He had a struggle going on in himself to begin with. This is what I'm trying to say. the church had a struggle going on in herself. And there was all of this confusion, struggle, chaos reigning all along. I'll tell you this much, I can say this safely. If Malachi were alive today, by goodness, would he have some books coming out about a Jesuit pope and about confusion and about direction of the church would be something else. But he believed that was happening already in the 1960s and 70s. And when he woke up to it, really the real problem of it, he was outside looking in.
Mm-hmm.
And for the rest of his life tried to get back inside as an exorcist, as a priest, and then I think there was rumor that he had become a bishop. But the point is, it was truly his struggle to get back in. There's no question of that.
I mean, you're really talking about the journey of a soul. Do we have a few more minutes, Father?
Yes.
I hesitate. I want to ask you, can I bring up an allegation against Malachi that was told to me personally and is also in the form of a book? Would you mind if I did that?
No, I know the allegation.
Well, there's this book here.
Clerical error, yes.
Clerical error. There's a young couple there, and it's those lights in the building. That's the Apostolic Palace. That's St. Peter's Square. There's a young couple kissing. And it's called Clerical Error. And here's the name of the author at the bottom, Robert Blair Kaiser. Now, Robert Blair Kaiser has died. But I spent the whole day with him in 2002 when this book came out. When he came to the press office in Rome, found me there by chance, said, "I've been reading your magazine." He said, "I think you'd like to hear my story." And I said, "I certainly would like to hear your story." He said, "Yes, I knew Malachi Martin very, very well. He was my friend. We talked daily in 1962 when he was the secretary of Cardinal Bea." And
Robert, if I may, I just to throw this into what you're saying.
Yeah.
Robert
Blair Kaiser
was also a Jesuit. Had also been a Jesuit. Don't forget that, okay?
I know. Okay. And so what I'm just for our audience, I'm reporting a conversation that it became a book, and I cannot judge it. In the book and in other articles outside the book, there were reports that Robert Blair Kaiser had suffered a nervous breakdown and was suffering from schizophrenia. And he even went to a clinic. Of course, covering the Vatican can lead to psychological problems. But he quit and was replaced as the Time correspondent and went to a kind of halfway house somewhere. And here's something about this. Oh, this is an article that I wrote about this whole story anyway. So this is not new. But he affected me deeply because he was confessing to me, as it were, saying this happened, then that happened, this happened, I didn't realize, and then I understood. And he said Malachi became friends with his wife and then actually a lover of his wife. And that his wife decided that she wanted to leave him and marry Malachi Martin. That's what he told me. And that's what this book tells the story. And he said then Malachi had promised that he would come to her, whether in America or meet her in Ireland, and that he would marry her, and that he never did. And there were other people involved in this story, including Father John Courtney Murray, who was also talking with the Time correspondent and talking with Malachi Martin, who was the secretary of Bea. And this is the source of my report that Time magazine gave $20,000 every month to Robert Blair Kaiser. He was only 30 years old, a young guy. You can imagine him. You were a young man in Rome. Could you imagine being there at the time of the Second Vatican Council and seeing Karl Rahner and
I'll tell
seeing?
you this. I'll tell you
Mm,
this. If I were there as a young man with my own apartment, very close, very not far, a stone's throw from the Jesuit in downtown Rome, very elegant apartment by the Collegio of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius Church. Very posh, very posh, right in the center of the city, and $20,000 a month in those years. God knows what would have become of me.
well,
God knows what would have become of me.
no. He said that he was instructed to have meetings, that is, dinner soirees with some wine and
Yes,
prosecco, some liquor, some hors d'oeuvres, starting I don't know when, at 6 or 7 or 8, and going to 10 or 11 or midnight, and 100 or 120 people would show up, and they would be bishops who were going to the council. They would be reporters from France and Germany, America. They would be periti who were assisting the bishops. And the thrust of it, he said, we were instructed by Time magazine to get the message across. This was a chance for the church to make a break with her past, her hidebound past, and liberate herself and become a wonderful modern society that could help the modern world. And therefore, it is my belief that there were influences on the council, at the edges of the council, in this type of apartment, that have never fully been accounted for, and explain the shift that the council took from merely rubber stamping the documents prepared by John the 23rd and his curia to be voted on in the fall of 1962. None of those were voted on. They were rejected. They set out to rewrite them, and all the documents were rewritten. They went for 4 years instead of 1 year, and we had Vatican II came out of that. And embedded in all the documents were these phrases which could be interpreted ambiguously in one traditional way or in one modern way, and that these were picked up and used by the more modern thinking, more progressive thinking people, and that we've been dealing with this ever since.
yes, yes. That there were a lot of people with a lot of agendas during the council. Yes.
And,
Well,
and
there were a great number. There were a great number of bishops who were authentic. They're looking for solutions to situations that the church should be looking at and should be dealing with today. But there were other people who arrived with an agenda and with tremendous money and power behind them. You know. I'm not going to get into whom, but there were countries. Israel had a lobby there. They wanted recognition from the Vatican. They wanted a number of things. Russia
yes,
also,
they
the
had
Soviet
observers.
Union.
They had observers.
Yes, and they, to be able to have, imagine this, to be able to have, I think there were 3 or 4 observers from the Russian Orthodox Church present. Pope John the 23rd had to promise that communism wouldn't be brought up. Well, how in the world do you have an ecumenical council talking about the church in the world today and the challenges that the church in the world today faces when you can't speak about communism, which was the threat against the church all in so many countries? No, it was off the table. So there was a lot wrong with that council. There was a lot wrong with it. And there were a lot of lobbies, and there were, humanly speaking, there were.
Yeah. No, and so what you're referring to, just so our readers and our observers will know, the Vatican agreed that in order to have the Russian government allow visas and passports for Russian Orthodox and a staff to come and be observers at the council, the condition was that the council would not speak about or condemn communism openly. And therefore, they proceeded in this fashion. I have always felt that it was a protection and a wonderful fact that the council was pastoral and not doctrinal. Therefore, anything that they said was an attempt to try to make all traditional teaching more easily understood, more effective, but not to change any of it. And therefore,
And
that's
very good, Robert. Now stop there for a second. And that all led up to today, didn't it? And what's happening today? You know it, and I know it, and a lot of people know it. We don't want to say it too loudly because we're all a little bit afraid of our own necks. We'd like to keep our heads on our shoulders. Things are being changed, and doctrine is being tampered with, and those attempts are being given to change things. Just as the council was not in favor of any doctrinal change or any dogmas, we understand all that. Today, those changes are taking place. This is what has led to it. So it's not exactly the honest approach to the whole situation that it ends up doing exactly what it said it wasn't going to do.
Yeah, and what the word is for that, I think, is apostasy.
It is apostasy. You know it and I know it. Yes.
This means you reject teaching that has always been considered true and correct, and you say, well, we understand better now. We've developed the teaching in a new form here. We're just explaining it and expanding it. We're not rejecting it. But in fact, they are.
It is being rejected. That's right. Yes.
And
it is being changed. And it is apostasy.
And there was a prophecy at Fatima that there would be a challenge to the faith, a type of apostasy. And Malachi Martin was very interested in that question as well. I think we could come back to that in our next conversation. I think what we've touched on, we have been unable to give a complete picture, but we've touched on it like a French painter, an impressionist, puts some red here, there's the poppies, and puts some green here, there's the tree branches. We've given a few insights into an important man who struggled and wrote beautifully, was brilliant, and he left a legacy of warning to us about the church possibly going in. Hi, what happened? No, we discussed. Father Murr, are you still with us? Okay, we lost you, I think. So we'll wrap up this program, and we appreciate everyone who's been listening to us. We're going to see Father Murr in about 4 weeks' time. He's in southern Spain. We're going to have a retreat with him. We have 2 places open on this retreat, and you can find it at InsideTheVatican.com. You can send us a message, or InsideTheVaticanPilgrimages.com as well. And thank you for listening. Like the program, tell other people about it, and we will continue and go forward as best we can. Have a wonderful Lent, spiritually productive. All best wishes. Thank you.
Join us for a unique pilgrimage, a Lenten retreat with Father Murr in March 2024. Pilgrimage through southern Spain, a beautiful land where the Catholic Church's rich 2,000-year history comes alive during Lent, and partake in a Lenten retreat led by Father Charles Murr, our friend. We will pilgrimage to several towns in the Andalusia region of southern Spain. The people, the history, and the traditions of these towns will give richness, beauty, and context to the talks of our retreat. Experience this once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage and Lenten retreat and grow closer to Christ as we prepare our hearts for the joy of the risen Christ.